The frontier has always been a place where men tested the limits of their courage, their faith, and the iron in their souls. But there was one place along that wild edge where the testing came not from blizzards, grizzlies, or starvation, but from walls said to be as unforgiving as the mountains themselves. They called it the Iron Fortress, a jail built so stout, so cleverly wrought, that no outlaw who entered ever walked free again. In the years when the Rockies were still more mystery than map, that claim was enough to make even the most desperate horse thief think twice. The 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds were decades when the West was less a place than an idea. A shifting wilderness ruled by trappers, traders, and tribes who knew the rivers by feel, not by name. Fort Laramie stood like a lone sentinel on the Platte. Bent's Fort rose red and square from the Arkansas plains, and Fort Union guarded the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone like a fortress of trade. These were the beating hearts of the fur trade, where beaver pelts passed for currency and whiskey kept the peace until it didn't. In that rough company, the law was a rumor that came late and left early. A man's word was his bond, but a loaded Hawken rifle was better. Fights over horses, furs, or women ended in blood, and justice, if it came at all, came on a rope or beneath a knife. Yet even the wildest settlements needed some notion of order, and out of that need came the idea for a jail, a place where the lawless could be contained until judgment found them. It began at the edge of the mountains, near a bend in the Green River where trappers and traders met each summer for the great rendezvous. Here, in the no-man's land between U.S. jurisdiction and Crow territory. A mixed band of men, soldiers from Fort Laramie, trappers from the Missouri, and a handful of Crow and Shoshone guides raised a building unlike any other on the frontier. They used what they had: wagon rims for bars, cottonwood beams hewn by hand, and river stones packed tight with a mortar of ash, sand, and buffalo fat. The walls were 3 feet thick, the door a slab of iron plate scavenged from a steamboat wreck on the upper Missouri. The work was led by a blacksmith named Isaac Iron Hand McCall, a broad-backed Missourian who had followed the fur trade west after losing everything in Street Louis. McCall was no lawman, but he understood men and metal both, and he built the jail as if he were forging a piece of himself, unyielding, enduring, and cold. "A man can break another man," he was known to say, "but not iron set right." When it was done, the fortress squatted against the wind like some primeval beast, its chimney coughing black smoke, its windows no wider than a rifle barrel. Word of the jail spread quick through the mountain circuit. The voyageurs out of Fort Union swore it could hold the devil himself. Kit Carson, then a young hunter out of Taos, was said to have called it a tighter pen than any the Mexicans ever built. Even the Crow, who scorned white men's prisons, gave it a name in their tongue that meant house of no return. The jail's first guests were horse thieves, 3 of them, caught red-handed trying to drive off a dozen prime mounts belonging to the American Fur Company. They laughed when the trappers hauled them in, but they stopped laughing when McCall dropped the iron door behind them. For 3 weeks they raged and hammered until one morning the guards found them silent, their fingernails torn to the quick, their spirits broken like wet rawhide. When their sentence was done, 2 went straight back east. The 3rd stayed on, choosing honest labor over the memory of that cell. So began the legend. Every fort along the frontier had its own stories of escape: the drunken deserter who tunneled out of Bent's Fort, the half-breed thief who slipped his bonds at Fort Hall, but none came from McCall's stronghold. It was said that the jail breathed cold in the summer and stifling heat in the winter, that its stones whispered when the wind came down off the peaks. The men who guarded it were cut from the same cloth as those who built it, mountain men with faces like weathered bark, more at home among wolves than within walls. They took their duty serious, not out of love for the law, but out of respect for what they'd made. The jail was their proof that the wilderness could be tamed, if only a little. They knew what it was to live by tooth and claw, and they understood that even the roughest breed needed boundaries. Visitors to the fort, missionaries, traders, soldiers passing through, would always ask the same thing: Why build such a place here, at the end of the earth? McCall's answer never changed. He'd lift his hammer, gesture toward the mountains, and say, because there's no other place left to run. Through the years, the jail came to hold more than thieves. Murderers, deserters, and renegades found their way into its belly. Some awaited trial by territorial courts, others by the rougher justice of trapper councils. A few never left at all, their bones buried beneath the cottonwoods where the Green River bends. Yet, for all its grim purpose, the fortress became a symbol of something larger. To the settlers and traders, it was a bulwark of order amid chaos. To the mountain men, it was a mark of pride, proof that even in the harshest land on earth, they could craft something that would endure. And to the outlaws, it was a warning whispered from campfire to campfire. You can cheat the hangman, but not the iron fortress. As the years passed, the legend grew. Men claimed to hear chains rattling in its walls when the wind came down from the north. A few swore they saw faces in the iron door shadows of those who'd tried to break free. McCall himself grew old within sight of his creation, tending the forge and repairing the locks until his hands could no longer lift the hammer. When he died, they buried him beside the jail, his grave marked with nothing but a single iron cross. By then, the frontier was changing. The fur trade waned, the buffalo herds thinned, and soldiers replaced trappers at the forts. But still the iron fortress stood, weathering storms and time alike. Its walls rusted and its door pitted, yet it never yielded. Travelers along the emigrant trails would stop to stare, some crossing themselves, others shaking their heads in wonder. No one ever escaped. That, at least, was the story told from the Wind River to the Yellowstone, from the rendezvous camps to the distant Missouri. In a land where legends were born faster than men could die, the iron fortress remained the one tale that none dared to doubt. It was the mountain's own kind of justice, silent, unbending, eternal. They say a man's work outlasts his bones. If that's true, then Isaac Iron Hand McCall and the men who stood beside him still live in the whisper of the hammer and the groan of the mountain wind. The iron fortress didn't rise from blueprints or orders stamped in ink. It came from sweat, iron, and the shared stubbornness of men who'd seen what chaos looked like up close. McCall had been a blacksmith back in Street, Charles, Missouri. In the early days, before the beaver trade called every restless soul westward, his forge had been known for making plowshares and shoeing horses. But when cholera came through the valley and took his wife and child, McCall left everything behind. He hitched his anvil to a wagon and followed the Missouri upriver, trading his old life for one that smelled of pine pitch, wet fur, and gunpowder. By 1832, he'd become one of those iron-hearted drifters who could mend a trap, forge a tomahawk, and set a broken leg all in the same day. It was at Fort Union that the traders started calling him Iron Hand, a name earned when a piece of molten iron burned through his glove, fusing the flesh into a puckered scar he carried proudly thereafter. When talk began of building a jail at the Green River crossing, it was McCall the traders called for. He didn't ask who would pay or who would guard it. He only asked what it needed to hold. The answer, men too mean to hang right away, was enough. He gathered a crew from among the wintering trappers, men who knew how to build in a land where tools were few and timber scarce. There was Jean LaRoche, a French-Canadian voyageur with a singing laugh and hands like oak roots. Elias, preacher. Grant, a runaway minister, turned beaver man who swore every blow of the hammer was a prayer. Running Wolf, a Crow scout who'd learned blacksmithing at Bent's Fort and claimed the fire spirits guided his strikes. They camped by the river through the thaw of spring, their tents black with soot, their arms striped with burns and calluses. From dawn to dusk, the valley rang with the rhythm of iron on anvil, a sound that carried for miles, echoing through the pines like a heartbeat. They melted down wagon rims, trap springs, and even gun barrels, turning the scraps of frontier life into bars and hinges. McCall kept notes in a journal, though none too fancy short entries about the day's work, the weather, and the men's tempers. LaRoche near lost a hand today, one entry read. Iron too hot, his grip too sure, said the mountain took its toll in flesh. I reckon it takes its toll in everything. Every piece of the fortress was earned the hard way. The foundation stones came from the riverbed, hauled by mule and levered into place with pine poles. The logs were cut high in the Wind River Range, floated down during the spring melt, and notched by hand. Even the nails were forged one by one. They worked through storms, through sickness, and through the kind of loneliness that only the high country can breed. Sometimes they'd stop at night, sitting by the forge fire as the iron glowed like the heart of the world. McCall would stare into it, his face coppered by the heat, and say, "We're making more than a jail, boys. We're building a promise." Grant would answer in that slow drawl of his. "A promise of what, Isaac?" "That a man's deeds catch up to him, one way or another." For all their hard edges, the men believed him. Out here, promises meant more than laws. The mountain didn't care for words, only action. By midsummer, the walls were rising. The door, an iron slab nearly 4 inches thick, was so heavy it took 6 men and a pair of mules to set it on its hinges. They sealed the windows with crossbars thick as a man's wrist and lined the roof with stone to keep it from burning in case of attack. When it was done, it stood 12 feet high and twice as deep underground, with a single narrow corridor leading to 2 cells and a storage pit. A trader from Fort Laramie who came to see it wrote in his diary, "It is a strange sight, this prison in the wilderness. The trappers regard it with awe, as if it were a fortification against sin itself." McCall was less poetic. When the last bar cooled, he struck it with his hammer and said simply, "Done." The men celebrated with a feast buffalo hump roasted over coals, corn cakes traded from the Shoshone, and whiskey passed in tin cups. They sang, argued, and told stories of the old days, of Bridger's first crossing of South Pass, of Smith's journey to California, of Beckworth among the Crow. Each story ended the same way, with the sense that the frontier was changing, and not for the better. The beaver were vanishing, the trade growing thin, and civilization was creeping west faster than anyone had guessed. That night, when the fire burned low, McCall sat alone beside the jail. The moon lit the mountains silver, and the wind carried the smell of pine and river silt. He ran his scarred hand over the cold bars and whispered to himself, "May these walls stand longer than the men they hold." And so they did. The iron fortress became a landmark for travelers and a curse for outlaws. It stood as a boundary between the wild and whatever order men could carve out of it. The builders went their separate ways. LaRoche was killed by Blackfeet 2 winters later. Preacher Grant died of fever on the Sweetwater, and Running Wolf returned to his people, where he was said to speak of the Iron Lodge that tamed bad spirits. Only McCall remained, hammering out repairs, sharpening tools, and teaching the younger smiths who came west after him. He lived to see soldiers arrive and the old trapping trails give way to wagon roads. But he never left the valley. When asked why, he'd smile that slow, tired smile and say, "A man ought to stand by what he's built." By then, the iron fortress was already legend. But the men who forged it, men of axe and anvil, were becoming ghosts, fading into the long memory of the mountains they'd tried to civilize. And the jail, black, against the dawn, waited for the next name history would carve into its stones. By the middle of the 1,830 seconds, the Green River country had filled with men who lived by the rifle, the trap, and the whim of fortune. The beaver trade brought them north from Taos, west from Street, Louis, and south from Fort Union Americans, French Canadians, Métis, and a scattering of runaway soldiers and farmhands looking for a life that owed nothing to anyone. They were free in every sense of the word, but freedom, left too long unchecked, curdles into chaos. And chaos is what the frontier had plenty of. There was no law west of the Missouri, not in the way civilized folk understood it. No courthouse, no sheriff, no jury to weigh a man's guilt or innocence. A man's right to live was as strong as his trigger finger and as steady as his aim. If a thief stole your traps, you found him and took them back, maybe left him with a bullet to remember you by. If a partner cheated on a beaver tally, you settled it with fists, knives, or whatever came first to hand. There were no appeals. Still, men are social creatures, even in the wild. The mountain men had their own kind of law, rough and flexible, but law nonetheless. At the summer rendezvous, those great gatherings of traders, trappers, and tribes along the Green or the Wind River disputes were settled before a council of respected old hands. They'd sit in a circle, pipes glowing red in the dusk, and listen to the grievances. Then one or another would give a ruling, short and final. If the accused was lucky, the penalty might be repayment or exile. If not, it might be a noose over a cottonwood limb. But sometimes the crimes were too tangled, too bloody for quick justice. Murder, treachery, desertion, these couldn't be handled by the code of the rendezvous. That's when the iron fortress came into play. Word of McCall's stone and iron prison spread fast down the trails. Traders at Bent's Fort spoke of it in awe. Missionaries, heading toward Oregon, called it God's outpost. To soldiers from Fort Laramie, it was a godsend somewhere to hold army deserters and whiskey peddlers who'd have otherwise vanished into the hills before sunrise. By 1837, the Iron Fortress had become the unofficial courthouse of the northern Rockies. The men who brought prisoners there were as hard as the stones they built with. Some were trappers deputized for the job, others were Army scouts on loan from Fort Laramie. They carried their captives on horseback, often through snow so deep the horses floundered. There were no wagons too slow, too exposed. When they arrived, McCall would meet them at the gate, hammer in hand, face blackened from the forge. He'd look the prisoner over, spit, and say, "Put him in." He never asked their crimes. That was someone else's business. His was to make sure they stayed. Among the worst of those who passed through the fortress were the deserters. The army sent them west with dreams of land and freedom, but many found only endless cold and hard duty. Some ran off to trap or trade, others turned thief or drunkard. When the soldiers caught them, they chained them hand and foot and marched them to McCall's door. One of the journals kept by a fur trader at Fort Laramie tells of such a case. A deserter from the 6th Infantry was brought to McCall's place under guard. The man begged for mercy, saying he had only wanted to see his wife again. McCall told him mercy ended at the river. The next morning the man was silent as stone. It was that kind of justice, firm, silent, and final, that made the Iron Fortress feared. Yet not all who ended up behind its bars were soldiers or cutthroats. Some were victims of circumstance, men who'd gambled wrong or drunk too much whiskey and found themselves on the wrong end of an argument. To these, McCall showed a trace of mercy. He'd let them work in the forge yard, shoeing horses or splitting wood, their ankles chained but their hands free. Many of those men later said that the sound of McCall's hammer, the slow, steady rhythm of it, kept them sane. As the 1,840 seconds dawned, talk of civilizing the frontier grew. Missionaries moved west with their hymn books, settlers followed the wagon trails, and the U.S. Army began to plant flags where trappers once pitched tents. Law was coming, slow but sure. But in those years before the territories were drawn and courts established, the Iron Fortress stood alone as the only real barrier between the wilderness and order. Travelers spoke of it in every trading post and way station. It became a kind of symbol, a reminder that even in the wildest country, man still tried to draw a line between right and wrong. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale keeps an old sketch from that era drawn by a passing artist in 1841. It shows the fortress under a snow-choked sky, smoke rising from its chimney, and 2 mounted guards watching the hills. Beneath the drawing is a single line, "Law west of the river," and there was law, of a sort, harsh, primitive, but real. Around that time, a name began to pass from campfire to campfire: Red Jack Hollis, an outlaw who would soon put the Iron Fortress's reputation to the test. Hollis was a horse thief out of Missouri, part desperado, part legend. Some said he'd run with the border gangs back east, others that he'd murdered a paymaster near Santa Fe and escaped through the mountains. Whatever the truth, by 1843 he was wanted from Independence to Fort Hall. He was the kind of man McCall's jail had been built for, bold, cunning, and mean as a cornered wolf. And when Hollis finally crossed paths with the mountain men near the Green River, his fate would make the iron fortress more than just a legend of craftsmanship. It would make it a monument to justice in a land that barely knew the word. But that's a story for the next fire, when the wind dies down and the night grows long. 4. Now, know this. By the time Red Jack Hollis rode into the high country, every man from the Yellowstone to Taos knew one thing for certain. There was no law west of the river, except the one built from stone and iron. They called him Red Jack Hollis for the color of his hair and the temper that came with it, a blaze that could turn from laughter to murder in the space of a heartbeat. By the time he reached the Green River country in the winter of '43, his name was already whispered with a kind of fearful respect. He'd robbed traders along the Santa Fe Trail, shot 2 men over a card game near Bent's Fort, and vanished into the wilderness like smoke. The Army wanted him. So did the Missouri law. But in the mountains, those warrants meant less than snowflakes on a campfire. Hollis was no ordinary thief. He was clever, spoke enough Crow and Shoshone to trade, and had a knack for slipping between worlds. Some said he'd lived with the Utes for a season, others that he'd guided emigrant trains before turning to outlawry. Whatever truth there was in the tales, he knew the land, knew it the way only a man running from his own shadow can. But the mountains, for all their vastness, have a way of closing in on a man who's done too much wrong. It was in the late thaw of spring that the trappers caught his scent. A horse had gone missing from a trader's camp along the Green River, a fine bay gelding, government stock with a brand clear as daylight. A week later, a Shoshone scout named Broken Knife brought word that a red-haired stranger had been seen riding such a horse through the Hoback Basin, heading north with a pair of Crow women and a pack mule loaded with trade goods. The word passed quick through the camps. By the time it reached the men at the Iron Fortress, there was no doubt. Red Jack was near. Isaac McCall didn't lead the hunt, but he knew the men who did. One of them was Preacher Grant's old companion, a half-Delaware scout named Ephraim, Fox Hanley, whose eyes missed nothing. Another was Luke Bonner, a trapper from Kentucky who'd lost a brother to one of Hollis's gang near the Platte. They rode out with 6 men, no lawmen, no papers of arrest, just rifles and rope. The chase lasted 5 days through country that could break a strong horse. They followed tracks up into the Gros Ventre Range, through canyons where the snowmelt ran fast and cold. Twice they lost him in the timber. But on the 6th morning, they found his camp a fire still smoking, a mule hobbled nearby, and prints leading uphill toward a narrow defile. Hanley told it later in his journal, which was found years after. The sun come up mean and red through the smoke. Bonner spotted him first a flicker of that damn red hair among the rocks. We hollered for him to give up. He answered with a shot that took my hat brim clean off. We went in after him like dogs on a bear. The fight was short and brutal. Hollis killed one of the trappers, outright, a Frenchman named Lafarge, before a bullet from Bonner shattered his leg. Even wounded, he kept firing until Hanley closed the distance and cracked him across the jaw with a rifle butt. When they dragged him back to the river valley, he was bleeding and laughing at once, calling them iron-hearted bastards. They reached the Iron Fortress 2 days later. McCall was waiting at the gate, hammer in hand. He looked at the outlaw, bound and filthy, and said nothing. Bonner spat and said, "We brought you a wild one, Isaac." McCall just nodded. "Then he'll fit right in." Hollis's trial was held 2 nights later, under torchlight in the yard outside the fortress. There were no judges, no jury, just a council of trappers and traders, as it had always been. Hanley recounted the chase, Bonner the killing of Lafarge, and a trader swore to the stolen horse. Hollis stood silent through it all, his green eyes bright under the bruises. When they asked if he had anything to say for himself, he smiled through split lips and said, "You think them bars will hold me, blacksmith?" "I'll be gone before the snow flies," McCall answered, voice steady as cold iron. "Then you'll be the first." The men voted, and the verdict was clear. Hollis would be kept alive until spring. There was no gallows yet built in the valley, and then sent under guard to Fort Laramie for formal judgment. In the meantime, he'd rot in the Iron Fortress. They threw him in the far cell, the one with the narrow slit of a window that looked toward the mountains. For weeks he made no sound, save for the occasional cough. McCall, who kept watch on him from the forge yard, noticed something in the man's eyes, not fear, but calculation. The kind of mind that measures every hinge and stone, looking for weakness. The guards took turns on watch, but Hollis was patient. He waited, watching the rhythm of the days, the comings and goings, the way McCall checked the locks each evening, before dousing his forge fire. He watched, and he waited for a chance. Outside, the spring storms came down from the peaks, slashing the valley with rain and wind. The rivers swelled, the trails turned to mud, and the mountain men grew restless, knowing that with summer would come the rendezvous and another year of hard trade. Inside the iron fortress, the legend of Red Jack Hollis was just beginning. McCall wrote one entry that month in his rough, soot-stained ledger. "We have a wolf in the cage. He smiles too often. I reckon he's waiting on the dark." He was right. For if the iron fortress had ever been tested by fire and time, it had never yet been tested by a man like Hollis, a man whose heart burned hotter than McCall's forge. And before the thaw was done, that fire would bring blood and storm to the valley again. For even the strongest iron, once struck long enough, begins to sing. The mountains always warned, before a storm first, with a stillness so deep the pines held their breath. Then with a wind that came whispering down the ridges like something alive. On that night in late May of 1843, the iron fortress sat dark against the sky, its stone walls wet with sleet and the river below roaring from the melt. Inside, a dozen men huddled near the stove, listening to the thunder roll across the valley. Isaac McCall had gone to check the locks one last time before bedding down. He moved through the corridor with his lantern held high, its light crawling over the riveted bars and the rough-hewn stone. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp iron. At the far end, Red Jack Hollis sat on his bunk, the chains at his ankles glinting. His face was shadowed, but McCall could feel the grin behind it. "Storm's comin'," McCall said. Hollis tilted his head. "Maybe for both of us." McCall didn't answer. He simply tested the lock, gave a nod, and turned away. The door clanged shut like the last word in an argument no one could win. Outside, the wind began to scream through the pines. The guards stoked the fire and drank their coffee thick and black. Men who'd spent their lives in the wild still felt uneasy that night. The dogs in the yard paced and whined, their ears flat. Something in the air felt off, like the whole mountain was waiting. In the prisoner's cell, Hollis sat awake long after the lamps died. He'd been working for weeks in silence, filing at the rivets of his chains with a shard of iron he'd pried loose from the bedding frame. Every sound was risk, every stroke a prayer. Now, as the thunder masked the rasp of his work, he knew his time had come. Two others shared the adjoining cell drifters, caught stealing whiskey from a supply wagon. Hollis had whispered to them through the cracks in the wall for days, feeding them promises of gold, women, and freedom. One had laughed him off. The other, a thin man named Pike, listened with a hunger that only the desperate know. When the clock struck midnight, Hollis stood, his chains loose around his ankles. He pressed his mouth to the wall and whispered, "Now." The next moments belonged to chaos. Pike began to shout and thrash, screaming that he was sick, that his gut was on fire. The guard on duty, a young soldier from Fort Laramie named Harris, grabbed his lantern and hurried to the cell. He never saw Hollis slip behind him. McCall, sleeping in the smithy loft, woke to the sound of clanging metal and the dogs barking mad. He was on his feet before his mind caught up, pulling on his boots and grabbing the old rifle that hung above the forge. Outside, the rain was hammering the roof so hard it sounded like musket fire. When he burst into the jail corridor, the lanterns were out. The place smelled of smoke and blood. A shape lunged at him from the dark pike, his face pale as bone. McCall swung the rifle like a club, catching the man across the jaw. Pike went down hard. Then he saw at the outer door hanging open, and beyond it, flashes of lightning over the river. Hollis was gone. McCall ran out into the storm, the wind near tearing the breath from his chest. He could barely see 10 paces ahead, but he followed the sound of hooves. The outlaw had taken one of the horses from the corral bareback, riding full tilt into the downpour. The river crossing was half a mile north, swollen and white with floodwater. By the time McCall reached the bank, he could just make out the figure on horseback, a ghost against the lightning. The horse stumbled in the current, slipping on the rocks. Hollis clung to its neck, cursing, but the river didn't care. It took them both horse and rider into the black churn. McCall stood there for a long time, soaked to the bone, watching the water swallow the light. Come dawn, the rain had stopped. The sky broke open into cold blue, the peaks shining like glass. The guards searched the banks for hours, finding only the drowned horse downstream and a boot wedged between the rocks. There was no sign of Red Jack Hollis. Some said he'd made it across, that he'd vanished into the wild country toward Jackson's Hole. Others swore they saw him later that summer near Fort Bridger, limping but alive. McCall said nothing. In his mind, he could still see that red head vanish beneath the water. That night, he sat by the forge, drying his rifle by the coals. The guards waited for him to speak. Finally, he said, "No man escapes the mountain." They repaired the broken locks, tightened the bars, and buried young Harris beneath the cottonwoods by the river. The storm had left scars, ruts in the yard, stones loosened from the walls, but the iron fortress stood firm, blackened and unbending. Weeks later, a crow hunting party found a body tangled in a driftwood snag several miles downstream. The face was half gone from the river's work, but the red hair left no doubt. They built a cairn of stones, where they found him and rode on. When word reached the fortress, McCall only nodded. He found his way out after all, he said quietly. Just not the way he planned. And so the legend grew. No outlaw had ever escaped the iron fortress alive. Not by cunning, not by force, not by prayer. The mountains themselves were its last warden. From that day on, when the wind rose and the chains in the cells rattled on their pegs, men said it was Red Jack's ghost, riding the storm forever, still trying to find a way past the iron. After Red Jack Hollis vanished beneath the flood, the iron fortress became more than just a jail. It turned into a shrine of sorts, an altar to the kind of frontier justice that didn't need judges or sermons. And those who kept it standing, those who guarded its doors and walked its cold corridors, were men carved from the same stone that made its walls. They were trappers and scouts, veterans of the fur trade, men who'd looked death in the face a dozen times and stopped counting. The army never paid them, no government sent orders. They stayed because the mountains had claimed them, and the fortress gave them purpose when the wilderness itself began to change. By the mid-1840s, the fur trade was dying. The beaver hats that once lined the heads of London gentlemen had fallen out of fashion. The great companies, American Fur, Hudson's Bay, were packing up, but the mountains didn't empty overnight. A few men lingered on, ghosts of a vanishing age, and some of them drifted toward the Green River Valley where the iron fortress stood. The first was Luke Bonner, the Kentucky trapper who'd helped bring down Red Jack. He returned to the fortress that autumn with nothing but his rifle and a mule named Molly. His trapping days were done. His left leg still ached from an old bullet wound. McCall put him on as watchman, and Bonner took to the job like a hound to a trail. He slept by the gate, rifle always within reach, and kept the records of prisoners in a rough ledger written with the blunt care of a man who knew words weren't meant to be pretty. Then came Ephraim Fox Hanley, the half-Delaware scout who'd chased Hollis through the mountains. He was quieter, quicker with a knife than with talk, and could read the ground like scripture. He'd worked for the Army a few years, guiding columns along the Oregon Trail, but he hated officers and their paper rules. McCall took him in too, and between him and Bonner, the fortress had eyes like a hawk. There were others in those years, drifters, freighters, even an old preacher who claimed to have buried 100 men and still couldn't find peace. Each brought his own story, his own ghost, and the walls seemed to absorb them all. The iron fortress became its own small world. McCall's forge never went cold. The anvil rang each morning like a church bell, calling the men to work. They patched the roof, fixed locks, and mended tools for passing wagon trains. A few soldiers from Fort Laramie stopped by every season, checking on deserters or trading powder for horseshoes. And always the same warning was spoken to travelers heading west. If you find yourself in chains, pray it ain't in McCall's jail. Bonner took pride in that. He'd walk the perimeter at dusk, pipe smoke curling around his beard, and tell the young guards, "Ain't a man alive can bust through these walls. You can feel the mountain's weight pressing down on 'em. Keeps the devils in." Hanley, more superstitious, didn't share that comfort. He claimed the place was haunted, that some nights he heard the sound of boots pacing the cells when no one was inside. One winter evening, when the snow was falling thick and the forge glowed red through the shutters, he told McCall straight, "Red Jack's still here. He never left. The river took his body, but not his hate." McCall just wiped the sweat from his brow and said, "Then he's serving his time like the rest." It was that winter 1846 when the fortress faced its second great test. The war with Mexico had drawn men eastward, and deserters from the army began to drift through the mountains, stealing horses, robbing traders, and seeking shelter in the high passes. One such band, a half-dozen men under a corporal named Tate, was caught near Fort Bridger and brought in under guard. They were hard men, soldiers turned scavengers, and they tested every inch of McCall's patience. Tate, especially, had the kind of grin that made honest men uneasy. He'd strut in his cell, tapping the bars with his tin cup, muttering about how no wall could hold him. Bonner warned him once. The second time, he broke the man's cup with the butt of his rifle. The deserters didn't stay long. The army sent word that spring, and they were marched east in irons. But their brief stay reminded everyone that the fortress wasn't just a monument. It was alive, still needed, still the last outpost of order in a land slipping back into chaos. The legend of Red Jack only grew. Traders passing through swore they'd seen his ghost on stormy nights, riding the ridges above the Green River, hair flaming in the lightning. One even claimed that he heard laughter in the wind, a harsh, mocking sound that made the horses rear. McCall didn't believe in ghosts, but he didn't mock the stories either. "Every man leaves something behind," he told Bonner once. "Some leave bones, some leave echoes." The years rolled on, the rendezvous faded into memory, the trappers into gray-bearded storytellers. The fortress aged with them. Moss crept over its stones, and the iron bars took on a coat of rust, the color of dried blood. McCall's hair turned white, but he still worked the forge, hammering out horseshoes and lock plates with hands that never lost their strength. Visitors from the east began to appear, explorers, surveyors, even a young writer from St. Louis collecting tales of the frontier. He spent 2 nights there listening to Bonner and Hanley trade, stories by the fire. When he left, he wrote in his journal, "These men are relics of another world. They speak of ghosts, storms, and justice without law." The iron fortress stands like a tombstone to an age of wild men and wilder dreams. By the end of the decade, McCall could no longer swing the hammer. His hands trembled and his breath came short. One morning he called the men together in the yard. The mountains were white with snow, the sky clean and bright. "I built her to hold men who couldn't hold themselves," he said, resting a hand on the cold stone. "She's done her duty. See that she keeps it." He died that night in his bunk. The fire burned low. They buried him beside the wall, just as he'd wished, with his hammer set upright at the head of the grave. After that, Bonner and Hanley kept the place going another few years. But without McCall, the heart had gone out of it. Still, they guarded it as if he were watching. When travelers asked why, Bonner's answer was simple: because the mountain still needs a jail. And maybe it did. For in a world fast losing its wild edges, the iron fortress remained silent, unyielding, and haunted by the men who had built and guarded it, and by one who had tried to defy it. By the time the 1,850 seconds rolled across the high country, the world that had given birth to the iron fortress was fading into smoke and memory. The old fir roots were turning into emigrant trails. The sound of beaver traps snapping shut was replaced by the creak of wagon wheels and the cries of oxen along the Oregon and Mormon roads. Men with families and plows now passed through the same valleys that had once belonged to trappers, crow hunters, and outlaws. But even as the frontier changed, the iron fortress remained a black shape against the mountains, outlasting the men who'd built it. For a while, the jail still saw use. The Army stationed a few soldiers there after Fort Bridger was established, keeping deserters and drunkards under lock and key until they could be sent east for court-martial. Luke Bonner stayed on as caretaker, his beard now white, his rifle leaning against the doorpost like an old friend. Ephraim Fox Hanley came and went with the seasons, guiding wagon trains one year, trapping mink the next. Each spring he returned to the fortress, always with that same wary glance toward the river. He claimed he could still hear the laughter of Red Jack Hollis when the storms rolled down from the peaks. But time has a way of softening even iron. By the close of that decade, the government no longer needed such a lonely outpost. New forts, Fort Kearny, Fort Bridger, Fort Hall, sprouted up along the trails. The iron fortress was too far off the main road, too isolated, too much a relic of an age men were trying to forget. One winter, no supply wagon came. By spring, Bonner was the only man left. He kept his post anyway. Each morning he'd tend McCall's grave, brushing the snow from the iron cross, then light a small fire in the forge just to hear it breathe again. When travelers stopped to rest by the Green River, he'd invite them in, pour them coffee, and tell the story of the fortress of its building, its prisoners, and the outlaw who'd sworn to escape it. Most would smile politely, half believing, half not. But a few those who knew what the wilderness could do to a man's soul listened in silence. When Bonner finally passed, sometime around 1861, a passing wagon train buried him beside McCall, marking the spot with a cairn of stones. The fortress stood empty after that, its door chained shut, its forge gone cold. The wind took up residence where men once labored, and the wolves prowled through the yard. Years became decades. Snow and rain worked at the mortar, but the walls held. Travelers on the new Union Pacific line heard rumors of a stone prison in the hills, and a few adventurous souls went looking for it. One early explorer, a surveyor named Edwin Carr, wrote in 1875, found the so-called Iron Jail near the Green River headwaters. Roof partially collapsed, but door still sound as the day it was forged. Inside, a single bunk, rusted chains, and what looked like initials carved into the wall, R.J.H. The place has a strange stillness, as though it remembers. By then, the names McCall and Bonner had all but vanished from maps and memory. But among the mountain men who still gathered in the saloons of Fort Bridger or the outposts along the Wind River, their stories were still told, passed down like gospel. Some claimed the jail had been cursed by Hollis before he died, that anyone who stayed there too long heard voices in the storm. Others swore that McCall's ghost kept watch, hammering in the dark to mend the locks against evil spirits. It wasn't until the 20th century that the fortress reappeared in the official record. In 1911, a party from the Sublette County Historical Society stumbled upon its ruins while tracing old trapper routes. They found the remains of the forge, a few iron nails black with age, and the faint outline of the cells. The local paper called it a monument to the old frontier. Later, historians linked it to records from Charles Larpenteur's journals and a letter from Fort Laramie referring to a prison of remarkable strength built by trappers. Over the years, archaeologists and storytellers alike came to study it. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale gathered what fragments could be salvaged: rusted hinges, a door latch, a few hand-forged nails stamped with the faint mark of McCall's hammer. The Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal published articles about it, comparing its structure to early frontier forts and blacksmithing techniques from Bent's Fort and Fort Union. No one could quite agree whether it had truly been escape-proof, but all agreed it symbolized the rough justice of a land too big for laws written on paper. Today, visitors still hike up to what remains of the Iron Fortress. The walls stand waist-high now, swallowed by sagebrush and thyme. In summer, wildflowers bloom where the cells once were, and in winter the snow piles against the stones, the wind whistling through the gaps like a whisper of chains. There's a bronze plaque nearby, placed by the American Mountain Men Association, that reads, "Here stood the iron fortress, built by trappers and traders of the Green River country, 1,834. 1,844. No outlaw ever escaped its walls." Dedicated to Isaac Iron Hand McCall and the mountain men who tamed the wild, one hammer blow at a time, scholars debate the truth of the old tales. Some say Hollis was just a frontier myth, a story born of whiskey and winter nights. Others, pointing to journals and Crow oral traditions, argue he was real, a horse thief whose failed escape became legend. But for those who stand in that quiet valley, where the river still glints under the same sun McCall once knew, truth hardly matters. The air itself seems to hum with memory. On certain nights, when the storms sweep down from the Tetons and the lightning forks across the plains, ranchers claim they can hear it, the faint ring of a hammer against iron, echoing through the rain. They say it's McCall at his forge, still tending his work. Others swear they see a rider on the ridge, hair bright as flame, forever chasing the river that took him. Whatever the truth, one thing endures. The iron fortress was never just a jail. It was a monument to the grit of the men who built it, the law they forged in a lawless land, and the price paid by those who tried to defy it. In a world now fenced and mapped, it stands as a reminder of a time when the frontier itself was the only judge and the mountains the only jury. And in that vast silence, where the wind moves like a prayer over stone, the legend of the iron fortress still holds fast. In the end, wrote a historian in Give Your Heart to the Hawks, the West was not conquered by gun or gold, but by the hammer and the will of men who believed they could make order from wilderness. The iron fortress was their cathedral, and so it remains part myth, part memory, but wholly American. The impossible jail no outlaw could escape, still standing in the heart of the mountains, unbroken even by time itself.